Can you believe that the only thing standing between a few hundred souls and the absolute, screaming abyss of oblivion was a few rough-hewn logs and the crumbling, prayer-worn stones of a chimney? This is not a legend whispered in the dark. This is the savage, frozen reality of Transylvania, 1800 CE, where life was not a gift, but a perpetual, desperate siege against the mountain itself.
Deep within the unforgiving, icy maw of the Carpathian range, the villages of Vichel and San Petru huddled like desperate, dying embers in the snow. They thought they knew cold. They thought they understood hunger. They were wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. What they were about to face was a catastrophe no one saw coming, an ancient horror awakened not by the moon, but by the unprecedented, unnatural behavior of the sun itself. For generations, they followed the strict, brutal calendar of the mountains, planting, harvesting, and then the long, grinding retreat into the fortress of the long winter. The stone walls, thick and damp, were their armor, the wood fires, their beating hearts. Every single piece of timber cut from the cursed forests was a victory. Every spark struck was a miracle against the encroaching shadow that threatened to smother everything. But this year, the shadow arrived early, and it brought with it an impossible silence. The air didn't just chill, it solidified, locking the very breath in their chests. The typical November snows had begun in late September, a curtain of white fury that sealed the passes, cutting them off not just from the outside world, but from neighboring settlements less than a day's ride away. Imagine the moment. The seasoned elders, men whose faces were carved by decades of frozen wind, looked up at the sky and saw something that stopped their ancient hearts cold. The snow was falling, yes, but it wasn't the white, granular fluff they expected. It was dense, heavy, and it carried a peculiar metallic stench, like old blood mixed with pulverized granite. And then came the worst sign of all, the chilling harbinger that drove panic deep into the guts of every man, woman, and child who understood the mountain's language. The wolves did not howl.
They had always howled. They were the symphony of the night, a terrifying but familiar presence. Now, there was nothing. Just the deafening, pressing weight of the snow, and the sound of their own frantic, shallow breathing. The silence was the first sign that the rules had changed, that the hunter had become the hunted, and that something vast and ancient had shifted its gaze directly upon their small, insignificant world.
En Vichel, old Georgi, the stone mason, whose hands had built half the chimneys in the valley, stood outside his door, the massive oak planks straining under the snow load. He hadn't slept in 3 days, not since the cattle started behaving strangely.
They weren't just agitated, they were paralyzed, staring at the ceiling of the barn, their eyes wide and white, refusing to take the hay, refusing to even move from their stalls. It was as if they saw something hovering just beyond the limits of human perception. Georgi swore he heard the stone itself groan beneath the unnatural weight, not of the snow, but of the pressure, a geological, bone-crushing force that seemed to emanate from the earth's frozen core. He grabbed his iron axe, the tool that symbolized his defiance against the wilderness, and felt a tremor run through the handle, vibrating unnervingly, even though the air was perfectly still. He knew with a certainty that iced his blood that this was not just a harsh winter. This was the mountain calling for its tribute, and it demanded more than just a few frozen crops this time. It demanded everything they had built, everything they cherished, and perhaps the very sanity that kept them tethered to life. This relentless, premature winter was weaponized, a siege engine aimed directly at the heart of their culture, driving them deeper and deeper into the dark, relying on nothing but the flimsy protection of their ancestral homes. Every stone laid by their grandfathers was tested, every joint in the timber strained under the weight of something truly monstrous. The stories they told around the sputtering hearth, tales of icy specters, of things that drink the heat from the soul, of the silent walkers, suddenly weren't folklore anymore. They were preparation. They were the instruction manual for the final days. Can you imagine the fear? Being trapped kilometers deep in snowdrifts that reached the roofline, knowing that if the fire died, you died, and hearing the scratching, faint yet insistent, coming from inside the walls. The scratching that didn't sound like a rat or a hungry bear, but something intelligent, calculating, and patient, testing the integrity of the stone, searching for the weakest point in their defense. This wasn't just a battle against the cold. This was a war for survival against an enemy that preferred the darkness, an enemy that thrived in the chilling grip of the longest, deadliest winter Transylvania had ever seen. Get ready, because the true horror of the Carpathian night is about to unfold, and what happened next would rewrite the definition of human resilience, or destroy it entirely. The clock was ticking, and the stones were beginning to crack. The stones were not merely cold, they were screaming. That sound, low and resonant, vibrated through the floorboards and up the spines of the huddled villagers. The sound of granite and limestone submitting to a force far greater than mere winter, a force tearing matter apart at the molecular level. This was the catastrophic physics of extreme contraction, played out on the walls of every home in Corvinesti. The mortar, a brittle mixture of lime and sand, was powderizing into a fine, icy dust that sifted down onto the hearths, contaminating the dwindling heat source. Old man Yanku, the village mason whose hands had laid every foundation for 50 years, watched his life's work disintegrate before his eyes, reduced to rubble by an invisible, crushing pressure. This was not the familiar enemy of biting wind. This was a geological assault on human civilization. The temperature drop in the previous 24 hours had been unprecedented, a vertical plunge that defied all meteorological memory or local folklore. They were trapped in a thermal event horizon where the ambient air was actively sucking the heat from solid objects, turning even the thickest stone into a liability. Their ancient defense, the sheer mass of the walls, was now their Achilles' heel, a gigantic, freezing heat sink, drawing warmth from the pitiful fires and the very bodies huddled inside. George, the newly appointed foreman, ordered the immediate cessation of all non-essential activity. Every calorie counted. Every breath of warm air was a resource to be guarded with silent, desperate ferocity. The wood stores, meticulously stacked and dried, were vanishing at an alarming speed. The massive ceramic stoves, designed to radiate warmth for hours on a single firing, now demanded constant, greedy feeding, just to keep the central room's temperature hovering just above the threshold of lethal hypothermia. George stood before the communal reserve, the air so cold his lungs ached with every inhale, and performed the horrifying arithmetic. At this rate of consumption, factoring in the wood that was now too wet or too deeply frozen to burn efficiently, they had 6 days. After 6 days, the remaining timber would be exhausted, and they would be left to face the siege using only their own body heat and the diminishing thermal reserves of the stone structures themselves. A battle they knew they could not win. The psychological toll began to manifest in terrifying ways. The villagers stopped looking at the windows for fear of what they might see. They had always known the darkness held ancient things, but this cold felt different. It felt intelligent. They whispered of the strigoi and the varkolachi, creatures of the night, but this overwhelming quiet, a cold that swallowed sound itself, suggested a malice far older, perhaps even elemental, indifferent to human suffering. The dogs, usually fierce protectors, lay in silent, shivering bundles, refusing food, their eyes wide and perpetually fixed on the ceiling beams, waiting for the structural failure that would bury them alive. In the largest, most fortified house, the priest Father André attempted to hold a small service, his voice a frail reed against the roaring silence. But his words offered little comfort when the very icons on the wall, carved wood and painted plaster, were beginning to crack audibly. The water barrels, kept indoors, now held only crystalline slush, requiring precious, controlled fires just to melt enough for drinking. The process of retrieving even a single bucket of water had become a high-stakes thermal venture, demanding immediate consumption before it refroze. The isolation was absolute. The snow outside was no longer the soft, insulating blanket of typical Transylvanian winters. It was hard, scoured ice mixed with impenetrable drifts, churned by winds that could strip the skin from a man's face in minutes.
Georg knew they had to reach the neighboring village of Rishnov, 3 hours away in normal conditions, to see if they were facing a localized tragedy or a regional catastrophe. But the trails were gone, erased by the sheer, blinding violence of the blizzard.
He chose 3 of the younger, strongest men, strapping them with furs, dried meat, and thick leather face masks. Their mission was simple: run as fast as possible, verify the survival of Rashnov, and return immediately. They left at the weakest point of the storm, a momentary lull that offered a perilous window of visibility. Less than 40 minutes later, the blizzard returned with redoubled fury, slamming into Corvinesti like a physical fist. Only one scout returned. He stumbled back through the newly sealed communal door, his exposed skin already turning the waxy, dead white of severe frostbite, whispering a single, horrifying phrase before collapsing into shock. The mountain, it is eating the path. The mountain, of course, was immutable, but the relentless cold had rendered the landscape unrecognizable, burying familiar stone markers, twisting tree lines into grotesque frozen shapes, and cloaking the entire world in lethal, disorienting white mist. The simple act of navigation had become impossible, confirming their worst fear. They were completely cut off, sealed into their fragile stone bunkers, while the world outside had transformed into an impassable, crystallized hellscape.
Georgi realized the strategy must pivot instantly. External aid was impossible. The fight was now purely internal, a desperate struggle against the geometry of their own homes.
He ordered a brutal, immediate triage. Every second floor, every peripheral storage room, and any windowed room facing the unrelenting north wind was to be abandoned and sealed off. The entire population of Corvinesti was compressed into the central core rooms of the village's strongest structures, creating dens of human misery and shared body warmth. 187 people, farmers, children, elders, and infants, were packed shoulder to shoulder, retreating from the implacable cold that sought to claim the very ground beneath their feet. They were now living in a world defined by the stench of unwashed bodies, smoke, and fear, a claustrophobic existence where privacy and space were sacrificed for the desperate chance of shared thermal survival. This forced proximity created new tensions, turning neighbor against neighbor over the rationing of fuel and the right to sit closest to the meager fire. The cold was not just a physical threat, it was a societal dismantler, chipping away at the foundations of community itself. As the sun set on the 6th day, the day Georg had calculated for the wood reserves to run out, a new sound pierced the night, louder and more terrible than the cracking stone. It was the sound of the thick, aged oak support beam in the oldest structure failing completely, shearing under the combined stress of weight, moisture, and extreme thermal shock. The crash echoed through the frozen village, a definitive statement from the environment. Their wooden defenses were yielding, their stone walls were crumbling, and the Carpathian night was about to demand its final, terrible payment. The payment was due, and the collector had arrived with the fury of 1,000 frozen winds. When the main support being, and more like the cracking of the world's spine, the air inside the dwelling, momentarily warmed by the desperate cluster of families, instantly dropped 15 degrees, a physical blow that stole the breath from the chests of children and paralyzed the old men leaning against the hearth. The brittle, mortarless stones of the outer wall, already weeping ice, finally surrendered, spilling inward not with a crash, but with a horrifying, slow crunch of pulverized rock and ancient dust. This was the moment the village of Raul Negru, nestled deep in the shadow of the mountains, realized their generational pact with the land, built on the promise of stone and the resilience of wood, had been brutally, irrevocably voided. They had always stockpiled, of course. Every man, woman, and child understood the unforgiving arithmetic of a Carpathian winter. 8 months of survival defined by the height of the woodpile and the density of the stored fat. But this winter was not merely cold, it was an anomaly, a savage, unending glutton that consumed logs faster than a forge devours coal, leaving behind only the ghost of heat and the lingering scent of desperation. The very fires refused to draw proper breath, sputtering and dying in the thick, pressurized chill that permeated even the deepest cellars. The last great reserve, hidden beneath a snowdrift in the central square, was already being rationed by the desperate, hawk-eyed council members, each piece weighed against the life of a family and the structural integrity of the remaining roofs. The oil lamps, once symbols of perseverance and the promise of dawn, flickered sickly, threatening to plunge the entire hamlet into a primordial darkness that was thicker, colder, and far more terrifying than the physical night outside. Darkness here was not merely the absence of light. It was an active predator that stole body heat and muffled the screams of the sick, lending an unnatural advantage to anything that lurked beyond the fragile palisades. The psychological disintegration was accelerating faster than the structural collapse. Sleep became a luxury reserved only for the dead. The living spent their nights huddled, listening to the agonizing groans of the stressed timber, the rhythmic howl outside that sounded suspiciously like a voice imitating wind, and the terrifying silence that occasionally fell, a silence that meant the ambient sound of life had finally been snuffed out in some nearby corner. Paranoia was the new currency. Why were the fires in the neighboring villages Vulturesti and Poyana, suddenly extinguished 2 days ago? A coordinated, horrifying darkness spreading across the valley floor. Had the cold simply consumed them entirely? Or had something else
been driven down from the high passes by the sheer, unholy intensity of the freeze. The villagers started eyeing the edges of the forest with a new, frantic dread. The stone walls were supposed to keep the cold out, yes, but they were also supposed to keep the things that lived in the cold out. The silent, starving wolves, certainly, but also the old, sleeping stories that Transylvania guarded so fiercely, the legends that whispered of creatures thriving when men froze. The old master builder, Iordache, whose hands had laid every foundation in Rio Negro for 50 years, sat weeping beside the crumbling wall, clutching a piece of ice-sheared oak. He understood the physics of failure better than anyone, and the failure he... The traditional construction method, heavy, interlocking logs sealed with thick mud and covered in stacked riverstone for thermal mass, was designed to handle natural cold, the predictable brutality of the mountains. But the current temperatures were far beyond the thermal threshold. They were plunging into a theoretical space where wood became brittle as glass, the mud sealant powdered away, and stone conducted the cold directly into the heart of the structure. The very foundations they relied upon were acting as gigantic thermal conductors, drawing the residual heat out of the earth and radiating the lethal chill upward, turning the floorboards into ice traps. Every movement, every step across the frozen earth of the longhouse was a step closer to the hypothermia that clawed relentlessly at their exposed skin, sucking the vitality from their core. The historical memory of the place, the terrible winter of 1703, the famine of 67, paled in comparison. This was elemental warfare, a siege laid by the very fabric of nature turned hostile. Children stopped crying, not out of bravery, but because the effort of weeping stole too much precious heat. Elder Petru, his face a mask of frostbite and determination, finally raised his voice above the desperate murmur of prayers and shivering, his voice raspy, but carrying the weight of command. We cannot stay here and freeze. The siege demands a counterattack. We must know the truth of the valley. The words were insane, reckless, a clear path to suicide, but they sparked a flicker of desperate life in the dying embers of the room. To step outside was certain, agonizing death within the hour, yet to remain meant a slow, suffocating demise within the week. The choice was merely the speed of their ending. They needed wood, desperately. But more terrifyingly, they needed proof that the villages downriver were truly empty, that their neighbors hadn't simply barricaded themselves and were now hoarding the last of the world's remaining warmth. Or, worse, that they hadn't fallen prey to something they couldn't name. The thought of betrayal, of neighbor turning against neighbor in the face of the ultimate cold, was almost as chilling as the air itself. 3 young men, Vasile, the strongest logger, his muscles still thick despite the starvation, Niku, the fastest runner, whose eyesight was unmatched, and George, the one with the steady hand on the ancient, unreliable musket, were chosen. Their mission, a suicidal 3-hour dash across the frozen wasteland to reach Poyana, less than 4 miles away, and bring back answers or resources. They wrapped themselves in every scrap of sheepskin and wool available, their movements heavy and labored, like deep-sea divers preparing to plunge into the abyss. When Vasile pulled back the heavy, iron-bound door,
dragging it inward with a shriek of tortured metal. The sound was immediately muffled by the roaring gale outside, but the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cold hit them not as air, but as a physical, crushing pressure, an invisible hammer wielded by the mountain itself, stealing their breath and freezing the moisture in their lungs. Their breath instantly froze, coating the inside of their improvised masks with painful, crystalline shards. And then, through the blinding curtain of snow and the chaos of the gale, Niku saw it. Not the shadow of the wolf he expected, but a movement that was too large, too upright, too deliberate for any natural creature surviving this impossible storm. Something massive, dark, and utterly silent was moving with terrifying speed between the stunted pine trees, heading straight for the only point of light left in Ral Negru. The hunt had begun, and the three desperate men were stepping directly into its path. The sound was no longer just the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy thump, buried beneath the howling gale, closing the distance with terrifying purpose. Gheorghe, his lungs burning with ice-cold air, knew that whatever hunted them was not burdened by the deep, crystalline snowdrifts the way they were. They were sinking, struggling, while the unseen predator moved with the effortless grace of true shadow. The light ahead, the last candle burning in the tiny, isolated watchtower, was their only focus. It was a single, defiant pinprick against the crushing blackness of the Carpathian night, but every step toward it felt like wading through freezing mortar. Mircea, the youngest, slipped, his cry swallowed instantly by the roaring wind, forcing Yosef to drag him up by the scruff of his thick wool coat, an act of sheer desperation. Every muscle screamed in protest. Every joint felt brittle and ready to snap under the relentless assault of the Arctic air that had descended upon Transylvania, a climate shift so violent it felt deliberately malicious. This was not weather. This was a weapon wielded by something titanic, designed to strip human resistance bare before the final consuming strike. Transylvanian villages, like Ral Negru, were never built for comfort. They were fortifications against the elements, structures of rough-hewn oak and fieldstone, thatched with reeds and desperation. They were meant to endure the historical, cyclical chill, to provide a meager shelter for the hardy Vlach shepherds and woodsmen. But this wasn't just elements. This was a siege of nature itself, where the cold was a physical, paralyzing enemy, leaching the very heat from their bone marrow in minutes. The historical defense mechanisms of wood and stone were failing against a force that threatened to freeze the very spirit of the earth. The temperature had plummeted far beneath anything recorded in living memory, dropping below the critical threshold where exposed skin freezes in seconds. Every breath was a risk. Every exhalation crystallized instantly into a cloud of deadly, suffocating vapor, obscuring their vision even further. They were running blind, led only by faith in that frail, distant flame. They slammed against the thick, icy oak door of the watchtower, built specifically to resist everything but focused supernatural dread and prolonged siege. Gheorghe pounded the iron ring, his gloved fists numb, screaming the secret password, his voice cracking against the wind's deafening roar. The silence from inside was immediate and horrifying. The candle glow was there, a flickering, sickly orange light filtering weakly through the cracks, yet no answering sound, no scrape of the bolt, no reassuring, gruff voice demanding identification. They were standing at the edge of salvation, but salvation seemed utterly abandoned. Then the thump was right behind them. It wasn't just heavy, it was synchronized, low to the ground, and carried a guttural, wet sound. The sound of massive effort, combined with savage hunger. It had closed the final 50 yards while they were struggling with the lock. Iosif spun around, yanking his ancient, rusted axe from his belt, the metal instantly shocking his bare hand through the thin leather. The edge of the axe was dull, meant more for wood than flesh, but it was the only promise of resistance he could offer against the approaching oblivion. He caught a scent, too, cutting through the sterile, paralyzing smell of ozone and snow. A musky, metallic odor, thick with blood, and something else, something ancient and feral, like wet earth mixed with raw iron. The snow, swirling around their ankles, suddenly seemed to be moving, shifting strangely, not just by the wind's command, but by something driving beneath it.
The latch. Break the latch, Georg roared, stepping back and kicking the heavy oak door with all the remaining strength in his frozen leg, hoping to shatter the crude internal locking mechanism. The door barely shuddered. This tower was built to keep things out, but they desperately needed it to let them in.
Mircea, his face pale and etched with primal fear, grabbed the heavy iron spike he carried for sounding ice depths and jammed it into the crack between the door frame and the jamb, leveraging it with all his young, desperate might. The wood began to splinter, emitting a thin, high-pitched shriek that was momentarily louder than the storm itself. That sound was their death knell. The moment the wood screamed, the thing reacted. It didn't wait. It charged the tower, not them. A monumental, staggering force slammed into the stone foundation of the little structure, shaking the entire tower like a child's forgotten toy dropped from a great height. Dust and ancient mortar rained down from the eaves, and a little candle inside flickered violently, threatening to plunge them into total, irreversible darkness. The impact was so severe that Iosif lost his footing, tumbling into a fresh drift of snow, momentarily stunned by the sheer brute power of the collision. Gheorghe stumbled back, his eyes catching the dark shape receding rapidly back into the dense, swirling snow curtain. It was massive, low, and terrifyingly fast, but the impact had left an unmistakable calling card. Deep, parallel gouges, etched into the frozen granite stones of the tower's base. These were not the random scrapes of frozen branches, nor the claw marks of a mere brown bear desperate for hibernation shelter. These grooves were clean, precise, and reached far higher than any ordinary predator could reach, suggesting a height and power that defied the very taxonomy of fear known to the mountains. With a final, agonizing splinter, the internal bolt snapped, shattered by Mircea's frantic leverage and Gheorghe's desperate kick. Gheorghe threw his shoulder against the door, collapsing inward into the relative, if terrifying, silence of the watchtower's entrance room. Iosif and Mircea scrambled in immediately after him, slamming the heavy oak shut and desperately trying to ram the broken bolt back into the rotting wood. They were safe, for now, trapped inside a tiny stone box with a flickering light and the lingering scent of smoke and fear.
But as Gheorghe's eyes, adjusting to the dim, struggling candlelight, swept across the small, windowless chamber, he saw the real horror waiting for them, a scene far worse than the monstrous beast prowling in the eternal winter outside. The watchman hadn't abandoned his post. He had been meticulously, terrifyingly rearranged.
The blood was not splattered. It was painted. The old man, Iancu, stepped back, his breath freezing solid in the air, a visible white cloud of shock. The watchtower, usually a bastion of safety, was now a tomb consecrated by a silence far worse than screams. The victim, the unfortunate Georg, lay geometrically centered, every limb placed exactly opposite its counterpart, a mockery of symmetry that suggested a mind, not a mindless beast, had orchestrated the horror. This wasn't the work of the lupul, the common wolf they knew that simply hunted for desperate survival. This was calculated performance, a message carved into flesh and bone. A heavy, sickening chill, colder than the deepest winter trench, settled over the small group of villagers who had followed Iancu into the freezing charnel house. The cuts were impossibly precise, almost surgical, stripping away the thin veil of civilization and the illusion that they were fighting a mere animal of the woods. The creature hadn't hunted for survival or hunger. It had hunted for message, seeking to shatter their collective will. They looked closer, their meager tallow lamps casting dancing, desperate shadows across the icy floor. The wounds showed not ragged teeth marks consistent with gnawing, but something far worse. Lacerations caused by claws of impossible strength and sharpness, tearing through thick, reinforced wool and multiple layers of leather, as if it were dry parchment. The tower door itself, made of ancient, iron-studded oak, harvested from the deepest, most resilient parts of the Borgo woods, was not broken down or splintered by force. It had been, impossibly, unlatched from the inside. This single detail slammed into their collective consciousness like a frozen existential hammer. The monster did not need to be strong enough to breach the stone and wood defenses they cherished. It simply knew how to operate the mechanism. Or, the most terrifying thought of all, it had been let in by one of their own.
The idea hung there, thick and toxic, poisoning the already frigid air with immediate paranoia. Who among them was capable of such a monstrous betrayal? Who could betray the ancient, fragile peace of the valley, handing a fellow man over to such an end?
Their stone walls and heavy wooden doors, the symbols of their endurance against the relentless, hostile elements, felt suddenly fragile, paper-thin against an enemy that understood the nuances of human architecture and psychology better than they did.
Yanku, wiping a smear of frozen vapor from his scraggly beard, forced himself to look away from the horrific tableau before his mind shattered entirely. Panic was a luxury they could not afford, a swift, cold death waiting to claim the weakest hearts.
We seal the gate now. Every crack, every loose stone, every window. We treat the village as a coffin, and we nail it shut. His voice rasped, barely audible above the howling, mocking wind that seemed to relish their terror and their shattered resolve. They descended from the tower, the sickening fear chasing them down the spiraling stone steps, each downward step a retreat from sanity. The constant snowfall was rapidly covering any tracks, but Iancu had already seen enough, committing the image to memory. Massive prints, far larger than any known bear, disappearing abruptly into the white void, heading east, toward the cursed, forgotten churchyard on the hill.
The immediate necessity was physical survival, but the underlying psychological damage was already taking catastrophic hold of the community. Whispers started instantly, acidic and sharp. Georg was always loud. Georg argued with the miller over firewood. He was careless with his prayer.
The monster had cunningly left evidence not just of its terrible physical cruelty, but of its deep psychological intelligence, sowing instant and corrosive discord, precisely where the community needed absolute unity the most.
They began stacking meager supplies in the central Casa Mare, the large main communal house that served as both a meeting hall and a fortress, preparing for a siege they knew intellectually they couldn't possibly win, only postpone through sheer, desperate willpower.
Barrels of cured meat, sacks of precious rye grain, and water drawn from the deep, protected well, all precious resources now guarded with immediately hostile, suspicious eyes. The paranoia was spreading faster than the bone-aching cold.
It was not just the horrific, ritualistic arrangement of the body that terrified them to their souls. It was the chilling realization that the beast had not consumed the surrounding abundant flesh. It had taken something else entirely. A small, dark, nearly invisible stain, only discernible to the most experienced tracker, marked where the watchman's beating heart had rested just hours before. Yanku later described the crushing sensation. It was not the fear of being eaten, but the fear of being used.
The creature was harvesting something intangible and priceless, something that fueled the ancient, unspoken stories told only around dying embers, when the moon was utterly hidden behind the perpetual winter clouds. This discovery was the final, dreadful confirmation that the darkness they faced was not just a natural phenomenon exaggerated by centuries of cultural fear and isolation. It was a hungry, sentient, malevolent darkness, deliberately targeting the symbols of their order, their faith, and their defense. The villagers spent the next harrowing, silent hours reinforcing the weak points of their settlement with frantic urgency. They dragged enormous logs, wet and impossibly heavy, to brace the main oak gate, chaining them with rusty, groaning iron chains scavenged from the old smithy. They filled every window gap with thick, insulating layers of dried mud and straw, sacrificing the last vestiges of natural light for the immediate thermal protection and necessary defense. Every hammer blow echoed through the frigid valley with the terrifying urgency of a death knell, a desperate, rhythmic prayer against the encroaching, oppressive silence. The very essence of their survival, the heavy stone foundations and the sturdy wood construction of their homes, was now put to the ultimate, inescapable test. They moved massive, rounded stones, traditionally used to weigh down the slate roofs against the violent Transylvanian gusts, and stacked them meticulously inside the doors of the outlying sheds, creating makeshift internal barricades against a foe they couldn't see. As dusk finally approached, painting the sky a bruised, angry purple, they lit the single, massive beacon fire in the center courtyard, desperately hoping the towering light and smoke would drive the relentless creature away, or at least keep it at bay for the duration of the long night. The flames roared, momentarily warming the frigid air and the deeply fractured spirits of the terrified people who clustered close to the heat. But the psychological relief was agonizingly short-lived. A sudden, impossible gust of wind, a violent wind that felt unnaturally focused, not diffused like a normal mountain squall, swept down from the upper ridge overlooking the village. It did not just dim the massive fire, it snuffed the enormous blaze instantly, plunging the entire central square into absolute, paralyzing, suffocating darkness. The profound ensuing silence was broken only moments later by a distinct and paralyzing sound, scraping relentlessly against the stone of the outer wall. The sound of long, iron-hard claws testing the defenses, assessing the specific vulnerability of their fragile human fortress. The hunt had begun in earnest, and the monster was knocking. The massive, grinding sound of stone scraping stone was not merely an attack. It was a promise. It was the sound of something ancient and patient, deciding that the time for subtlety was over. The creature testing the oak gates knew exactly where the weak points lay, targeting the very bedrock of the village's defense, the aged mortar holding the river stones together. Silence had been Gheorghe's greatest defense until this moment, the eerie vacuum of the winter night amplifying every scraping echo into a thunderous declaration of war. The air inside the cramped watchtower, already thick with the scent of fear and stale tallow smoke, seemed to crackle with sheer, unprocessed terror. Gheorghe, his face a map of 90 years of unforgiving Transylvanian winters, didn't flinch, but the oil lamp he held trembled violently. He knew that sound. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. Those attacked to eat, driven by hunger. This thing hunted for sport, for dominance, driven by a malice that defied the natural order, a horror resurrected from the deepest, most forgotten crypts of Moldavia. Matei! Gheorghe's voice was a harsh rasp, cutting through the horrified murmurs of the huddled families below. The young man, Matei, barely 20 summers old, but possessed of an unnatural strength carved from years of logging the forbidding forests, gripped his father's ancient, iron-bound axe. His knuckles were white, but his eyes held the necessary, cold focus. He was the anchor of their defense, the last unbroken man in a village shattered by unnatural dread. Gheorghe pointed toward the heavy wooden portcullis, the only entrance into the inner ring of houses. The chains, grease them now. If the outer wall fails, we must seal the courtyard and make this a slaughterhouse, not a feast. The defense strategy was simple, born of generations of siege history. Multiple layers. The outer perimeter was designed to absorb the initial shock. The inner wall, the palisade surrounding the central well and the church, was meant for the last stand. But the creature wasn't attacking the gate directly. It was circling the citate, the fortified perimeter, methodically striking at the old stone foundations where the frost had done its cruel, silent work. Each blow was precise, aimed not at shattering the rock, but at loosening the integrity of the wall itself, creating a structural weakness that would guarantee a catastrophic, controlled breach. It was thinking, utilizing the physics of human construction against its terrified creators. A high-pitched scream suddenly tore through the tense quiet from the northeast quadrant of the enclosure near the old granary shack. It wasn't the sound of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock and discovery. Someone had seen something, or perhaps someone had done something unforgivable. All eyes snapped toward the sound, the defensive coordination immediately fracturing under the weight of this new, internal crisis. Matei looked at Gheorghe, dread washing over the determination in his eyes. The granary watch, it was Yanku's turn, wasn't it? He swore he was sober tonight. Gheorghe shook his head, the movement slow and heavy with resignation. Yanku, a weak-willed man haunted by whispers of ancient blood curses, was notorious for his cowardice and his debilitating addiction to plum brandy, seeking oblivion from the ever-present threat of the mountainous wilds.
The monster had found its entrance, not through brute force, but through human failing. Gheorghe descended the creaking wooden ladder of the watchtower, his aged joints protesting loudly with every step. He didn't need to see the granary to know what had happened. Iancu hadn't just failed to watch, he had likely opened the emergency supply hatch, hoping to hide himself in the darkness, inadvertently providing a man-sized, easily exploitable gap in the defenses. The old man grabbed the massive silver crucifix hanging over the hearth, not for faith, but for the sheer weight of the holy metal, a desperate physical weapon. "Mate, stay here. Hold the portcullis if I call for it. No matter what you hear, do not follow me." Mate hesitated, the command locking him in place between duty to his leader and the surging need to protect his own kin who were huddled near the inner gate. Gheorghe crept along the inner pathway, the light from his sputtering oil lamp casting dancing shadows that transformed every stack of firewood and every dormant farming implement into a lurking specter. The cold was a physical pressure, pressing down on him, whispering promises of death and oblivion. As he neared the granary, the air itself seemed to drop 10 degrees, sucking the residual warmth from his woolen cloak, leaving his breath hanging like frozen ghosts. The silence that followed the initial scream was far worse than the claws on the stone. It was the silence of consumption, of a predator satisfied, or worse, a predator waiting for its prey to investigate. He saw the hatch immediately. It wasn't just open. The small, reinforced wooden door lay ripped from its hinges, fragments scattered across the packed snow like broken teeth. And there, leading away from the gaping hole, were 2 distinct sets of tracks. One set was Iancu's, frantic, clumsy boot prints leading straight toward the hatch. The other set was utterly alien. They were elongated, sharply defined boot marks, unnaturally narrow and disturbingly deep, as if the wearer possessed impossible mass. They led out of the hole and then, chillingly, vanished completely 10 feet from the wall, implying the creature had simply taken to the roof or the sky, mockingly abandoning the ground. But Iancu was nowhere to be seen. No blood trail, no struggle, just the open hatch and the impossible footprints. Gheorghe's ancient heart hammered against his ribs. Iancu hadn't been attacked and dragged off. He had been taken instantaneously and cleanly, suggesting a terrifying speed and efficiency that defied mortal hunters. This was a sophisticated, intelligent terror, one that used human weaknesses as its primary weapon. Then, Gheorghe saw the 3rd set of tracks, fainter than the others, leading not toward the granary, but running parallel to the inner palisade, toward the small wooden shed where the village kept its supply of consecrated earth and holy water, the only true spiritual deterrent they possessed against the encroaching darkness. These tracks were small, tentative, and worryingly familiar. They belonged to Marta, the priest's niece, a young woman rumored to be suffering from the night sickness, a paralyzing sleepwalking affliction.
The implication struck Gheorghe like a physical blow. The creature hadn't just exploited Iancu's panic. It had a secondary agent, perhaps a servant or an unwilling victim drawn into its terrifying service, acting as a scout or a saboteur. The cold outside was merely a shield, but the sickness of fear was tearing the village apart from the inside. They were not fighting a beast. They were fighting a calculated infection.
Gheorghe lifted the heavy crucifix, its silver surface dull under the weak light, and turned away from the granary. Iancu was gone, a lost cause. But the holy supplies could not be compromised. If Marta, driven by the creature's influence, managed to destroy the consecrated earth, their final spiritual defense would be lost, leaving them only with fragile stone and rotting wood against any mortal, insatiable hunger. He had to stop the girl before she became the instrument of their total destruction, before the monster decided to stop knocking and simply tear the roof off the world. The hunt was no longer outside. It had been flawlessly engineered to unfold right in the heart of the village.
The silence that followed the terrifying realization was worse than any howl. It was the sound of a perfectly sealed trap clicking shut. They were no longer fighting the elements. They were fighting the clock, a clock whose gears were grinding down their meager defenses with unforgiving, glacial certainty. Every breath stolen from the stagnant air of their small, smoke-filled homes felt like a countdown to zero, a desperate gamble against the encroaching, unnatural freeze that seemed to defy the laws of physics itself. The first betrayal came not from a claw or a shadow, but from the woodpile. Weeks of meticulous stacking, the very essence of their survival, began to fail. The wood, which should have burned with the fierce, reliable heat of pine and oak, merely smoldered, weeping thick, acrid smoke that choked the lungs but offered no true warmth. It was as if the moisture itself, deep within the cellular structure of the timber, had been supernaturally amplified, turning fuel into a damp, useless mess. This wasn't just poor drying. This was an insidious sabotage that targeted their primary source of life. The fires that defined the hearth, the sacred center of the Romanian home, were dying a slow, agonizing death, turning the village's heart into a cold, black cinder.
Panic was a dry, rasping thing, echoing in the cramped, low-ceilinged rooms. Old man Gheorghe, the village elder, whose memory stretched back to the Tsar's wars, pointed a shaking finger at the stone chimney, the massive, soot-stained central column that usually radiated life. "The frost," he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "It is forming inside the stone. It's pulling the heat out, not keeping it in." This phenomenon, scientifically impossible under normal circumstances, confirmed their darkest fears. The enemy was intelligent, focused, and utterly merciless in its engineering of despair. The lack of proper heat
meant the deep cold began to seep into the very foundations of their lives. Food stores, carefully buried beneath the earth, were no longer safe. The ground, usually a reliable insulator, had become a conductor of lethal chill. Barrels of salted meat, preserved sausages, and jars of pickled vegetables, the meticulously guarded bounty of the summer harvest, began to freeze solid, expanding and shattering their containers. This wasn't merely freezing. The process was happening with such unnatural speed and intensity that it ruined the molecular structure of the food, rendering it inedible, a brittle, icy sculpture of starvation. The silence outside was matched only by the desperate, quiet sounds inside the houses, the muffled crunch of a shattered wooden cask, the sickening crack of an earthenware jar splitting under pressure. The psychological warfare was relentless. They were being starved and frozen simultaneously, but the true terror lay in the forced proximity. 40 or 50 souls crammed into 3 or 4 homes, sharing dwindling heat and rapidly fraying nerves. Every cough became a death knell, every whispered disagreement a potential explosion. Trust, the foundation of any isolated mountain community, started dissolving faster than the snow in spring. Who had the most wood hidden? Who was rationing fairly? Who had failed to prepare adequately, potentially dragging the whole group down? The legend spoke of the creature not just as a physical predator, but as a master manipulator of environment and psyche. It didn't just want to kill them. It wanted them to destroy themselves first, to tear apart the social fabric that had held this tiny enclave together for centuries. Children, usually the robust, resilient heart of the village, began showing terrifying symptoms. Not just fever, but a deep, unshakable apathy, a coldness radiating from within that no blanket could cure. Their eyes, wide and unnaturally bright, seemed to see through the walls, fixed on some unspeakable horror only they could perceive. The grandmothers, the keepers of the ancient ways, started whispering frantic prayers in Old Slavonic, prayers long forbidden by the Orthodox Church because they skirted too close to pagan appeals to the dark forces of the Carpathian mountains. They were performing small, desperate rites, tying red threads around door handles, scattering ash across the thresholds, actions that spoke volumes of their utter abandonment by the conventional world and their reversion to primal defense mechanisms. They knew that when the cold turned malevolent, it was a sure sign that the veil between worlds had thinned to nothing. And then came the sound that finally broke the last remnants of order. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was the terrifying, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water where no water should be. High up in the heavy timber rafters, where the warm air met the engineered super chill of the roof, condensation was forming, and then immediately freezing into lethal,
razor-sharp icicles.
But it wasn't just dripping water. It was the moisture of the house itself, the lifeblood of the structure, being pulled into solid daggers. One of these icy spears, almost half a meter long, shattered onto the sleeping floor, near the corner where the children were huddled. The sound was like breaking glass magnified 10 times, a violent, sharp introduction to the reality that their stone and wood shelter was actively turning against them.
The monster hadn't stopped, no. It had figured out how to turn the very air they breathed, the very structure that protected them, into a weapon of surgical precision. They were sealed in a tomb, perfectly crafted from their own defenses, waiting for the final, slow, inevitable collapse.
The last fire in the largest hearth flickered, casting huge, dancing shadows that looked less like human figures and more like skeletal, hungry shapes. They watched it, mesmerized, knowing that when that final spark died, the engineered hunt would truly begin. The fight for survival was no longer about brute strength or cunning escape. It was about holding on to the last, fragile threads of sanity in a world designed to freeze hope itself.
The silence had become the loudest sound in the valley of Oravica, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from ice crystals and despair. No longer did the villagers whisper of wolves or spirits. They whispered of the chill itself, a primal force that seemed to watch them, waiting for the flicker of their hearths to finally die. The air inside the stone cabins was thin, tasting of burnt juniper and the stale breath of too many people huddled together. Every movement was a chore, every thought a battle against the creeping lethargy that promised a painless, icy sleep.
Father Nikolai, the village elder, his face a map of ancient sorrow, realized the food stores were manageable, barely, but the fuel was the true executioner, marching steadily closer with every sunrise they managed to survive.
The desperate search began with the systematic dismantling of their own history. The massive, meticulously stacked logs surrounding the communal kiln, meant to last until spring, had vanished weeks ago, devoured by the insatiable, frozen maw of this winter. Now the men were looking at the unseen reserves, the support beams of abandoned sheds, the long-felled timbers that reinforced the stream banks, the very fences that marked property lines. The skeletal structure of their meager civilization was being cannibalized for a few hours of fleeting warmth.
Mihai, known for his steady hands and usually unbreakable temper, had to be physically restrained when he saw the desperate woodcutters eyeing the massive, ancient carved wooden cross near the church gates. It was a line they swore they would never cross, a sanctity that held the whole village together against the tide of pagan dread.
But when the temperature dropped another unimaginable notch, plunging below the recognized limits of man and mercury, the sanctity dissolved into vapor. The cross came down, piece by painful, splintering piece. The terrible, echoing thud as the relic hit the frozen ground did more damage to their collective soul than the relentless cold had done to their bodies. It was the public, desperate execution of hope, the public admission that God had either abandoned them or was simply not listening to their frost-choked pleas. The act was not only sacrilege, but also a warning. If they would burn their sacred symbols, what would they burn next? The answer lay coiled in the darkest recesses of their minds, hinting at the desperate, unforgivable choices that awaited them when the last splinters were gone. And the ice, the very manifestation of this cosmic cruelty, responded to their desperation with bizarre architectural terror. It was no longer just frozen water. It was a living, breathing entity. Ice formations grew inward, spider-webbing across the interior walls of the stone cabins, seeking out the smallest warmth leak with surgical precision.
They had seen frost before, but this was different. The ice crystals were needle-sharp, intricate, yet fundamentally wrong. They carried no light, absorbing the meager glow of the tallow candles, making the rooms feel darker, denser, as if the cold itself was sucking the illumination out of the air.
The villagers started calling it Getzarul Viu, the living glacier, a slow, insidious geological life form intent on petrifying everything it touched, turning flesh and blood back into the primordial rock from which they sprang. Worse still, the main water cisterns, buried deep beneath the earth, and usually protected by layers of heavy stone and animal hide insulation, had begun to crack. Not from the natural expansion of ice, but as if something massive and invisible were crushing them from the outside, tightening the frozen fist around their most vital resource.
Ion, the youngest scout, returned from a fruitless, bone-chilling trek to the high ridges where they hoped to find deadfall. He wasn't carrying wood. He was carrying sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes, the kind of dread that sears the memory.
He claimed the high forest was silent, unnaturally so. The silence of a tomb held perfectly sealed. But that near the ancient, forbidden standing stones, the ones the priests warned about and the elders forbade approaching, he had found something impossible, a blatant contradiction to the laws of this cursed winter.
A circular patch of ground, where the snow usually lay meters deep, was exposed, and the earth beneath it was not frozen solid. It was steaming, a vapor rising violently into the crystalline air, only to freeze instantly 10 feet above the ground, creating a bizarre, reversed chimney effect.
This wasn't geothermal heat. The smell was wrong, metallic and sulfurous, like scorched iron and ozone. It was localized, a perfect, impossible circle of heat in a kilometer radius of absolute, killing frost. He described the trees around this steaming circle as being encased in a sheath of ice so thick it looked like seamless, flawless glass armor, yet their wood was burning inside. A slow, smokeless combustion, visible only as a shifting orange glow through the crystalline shell. The implication that slammed into the minds of the huddled survivors was monstrous. The cold wasn't just weather or a terrible season. It was a system, a bizarre thermodynamic machine that was actively stealing heat from specific concentrated points and intensifying the chill everywhere else.
This wasn't freezing. This was extraction. The energy they were losing, the warmth of the village, the life of the forest, was being channeled, funneled into some terrifying hidden mechanism rooted deep in the desolate earth.
They were not freezing naturally. They were being preyed upon by an unseen force that utilized the very laws of physics, the transfer of thermal energy, against them.
The fear shifted from mere survival to comprehension. If they understood how this was happening, perhaps they could fight it. But the sheer, unnatural scale of the phenomenon paralyzed them with the realization they were fighting something geological, perhaps even cosmic.